All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. This week, we're going to focus a little bit more on diplomatic matters, but we're going to start with what is really one of the major annual occasions on the Diaspora-Israel relations calendar, which is basically the Celebrate to Israel parade, which takes place every year in Manhattan. It's usually a relatively uncontroversial event with schools, youth movements, groups, organizations who, take out floats. I'm sure some of you were there, or some of you have been there in the past, and it's really a day to celebrate Israel. Usually Israel sends a few ministers, a couple of members of Knesset. They march together at the front with American dignitaries, the mayor of New York, some other American politicians, especially in an election year. You tend to see more than less. And it's just a joyful event. Obviously, there's always a very small handful of anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian agitators, but usually they make very little noise or dent in the celebration. This year, it became quite a point of controversy. First of all, it was reported at one point that around 18 ministers and members of Knesset were going to go over to the US for the parade. That's an unprecedented number. The majority of them were ministers and MKs from the opposition and coalition, and everyone tried to make a point that this was not about opposition coalition. This was just a day to celebrate Israel. But as one can imagine, it certainly didn't end up that way. First of all, there was the internal debate in Israel, whether it's worth all that money. You can imagine every minister that goes out, the security, the hotels, sometimes even hotel floors have to be taken out for each minister and their staff and everything. And there was a big debate whether it was necessary. It got to such a point where Netanyahu reportedly called some of his Likud ministers and asked them not to attend. And it appears Ophir Akunis and Nir Barkat were two ministers who heeded that call, and even though they were in New York, did not attend the annual parade. There were other events going on at the same time. So, those who went across didn't just go for the parade. There was the Jerusalem Post Conference, which is usually also one of the big events on the diplomatic calendar in the US. And there's also Arad Sheva, which is a conference for more right-wing members, which took place at the same time. There were obviously other events. What was most notable was that for all the, I wouldn't say the highest level members of the coalition, there were some relatively high level members like Nir Barkat. There was not, to the best of my knowledge, any high level meetings with their counterparts in the American government. We've spoken about that before. And there was this directive, although it hasn't been confirmed, obviously, from Prime Minister Netanyahu, that no one is to meet their counterparts until he has that vaunted invitation from President Biden, which is still lacking and doesn't seem like it's happening anytime soon. What was interesting is that Nir Barkat did take part in a discussion with major American bankers. He's the economy minister, or whatever they call his ministry today. And behind closed doors, or at least this is what was reported, was that there is going to be a compromise on the judicial reform issue. This is what the American bankers wanted to hear. This is, to try and stabilize some of the concerns about the Israeli economy. Obviously, economists like stability, and the whole judicial reform or the protests against them certainly weakened the Israeli economy, weakened the shekel against foreign currencies, and hasn't helped Israel stem inflation. So these words would have been comforting. Whether they're true or not remains to be seen. There is a lot of talk that the negotiations at the president's office are coming to an end, and there is a compromise on the horizon. This is certainly what Barakat tried to get across to his interlocutors in the banking world in the US, and even reportedly stated that Netanyahu was well aware of this and supported this and would not move forward until a compromise was on the table. What also happened over the weekend in conjunction with the Celebrate Israel parade, or maybe even weekend or whatever it is, coming off American Jewish Heritage Month, there was a big event at the American Embassy. And that obviously also got controversy because, for example, Simcha Rotman, really one of the targets for the hecklers in New York. And I don't know if any of you saw, but there was this whole controversy where people were screaming at him walking down the street with his wife, and even one got a megaphone in his face, which he confiscated or grabbed, and there was a police complaint, but it was subsequently dropped. That he's definitely was a target of these groups, whether they're expats, whether Israelis living in America, whether they're Israelis who are part of the reform protests, who came across specifically to protest, or whether just local Jews who want to show solidarity with the reformers. It's unclear, but what did also happen is that the Gala event that ended this whole Celebrate Israel festival that took place at the Israeli embassy in DC, Simcha Rotman asked to come at the last minute and was invited. He approached the foreign ministry, and the foreign ministry, obviously as a sitting member of Knesset, asked the American embassy, the Israeli embassy, to invite him, which he was. But a lot of the focus was put on that, and the Israeli embassy, you could see from a communique that they put out, too much focus was on this and not enough on what was a very high-level event. At that very same event was the US Vice President Kamala Harris, who made a comment which again stirred the hornet's nest here in Israel, where she made a comment about usual talking points about Israel and America being strong and valued allies based on common values, et cetera, and a throwaway comment at the end of one of her sentences was needs an independent judiciary. Well, Eli Cohen, who is Israel's foreign minister and usually one of the more moderate members, let's say, of the Likud, and certainly not one to wade in too much to this debate, appeared on radio attacking Vice President Harris and basically saying she doesn't know what she's talking about. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't think she's even read one single clause of the judicial reform. One can imagine what happened next, and the predictable happened. The American ambassador got on the phone with either Eli Cohen himself or Prime Minister Netanyahu, and shortly afterwards a more moderate tweet came out, extolling Kamala Harris's pro-Israel credentials, how she's a good friend of Israel, and Israel remain a liberal democracy. But it's these kind of events certainly that won't help bring that invitation from President Biden to Prime Minister Netanyahu to visit Washington come anytime soon. It's clear that there's a bit of a problematic relationship at the moment. There's mistrust, there's unease. A lot of it is around the judicial reform, but part of it is also around the nature of this government. And we saw Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, who attended an event in Paris, the OECD, where it's based, and he was not invited not only by any senior French official, but also by senior French Jewish leaders. There was an event where some of them attended in an unofficial capacity, but there was no event that you're more likely to see when an Israeli minister goes to a country. The Jewish community usually holds an official event, puts out some nice pictures, puts out a nice communique, maybe gives them an award, et cetera, et cetera. That certainly did not happen. So it's further than just the US. It's clear that this government is not being overly welcomed in many places in the West, at least. And that's certainly causing a lot of consternation, especially with Netanyahu himself. He's constantly trying to put out fires amongst those in his coalition who are taking a more hard line on issues. The Americans are not happy about issues to do with settlement building. Obviously, there's nothing new in that. But what it does do, it just adds to the fact that he has a problem. He has a problem because he can't break left, because there's nowhere to break left to in this government, because he is, Netanyahu, probably the most left-wing figure in this government. Previously, he might have had a Benny Gantz, might have had a Tzipi Livni, might have had an Ehud Barak, a Yair Lapid. All of these people have been in previous governments, but there's no one really here to break left to. So the far right can make comments, and they're not under Netanyahu's control, and this is causing him a lot of problems diplomatically. We're seeing it with Abraham Accords countries, even though there have been some high-level visits to Morocco recently. Netanyahu has not been given an official invitation to visit UAE. He is going to visit towards the end of the year, but that's an invitation that was sent out to multiple leaders. It wasn't personal to Netanyahu, and much of this is political language that's basically saying to Netanyahu, you're not wanted here at this point. You have to prove yourself. You have to give us something. And until that time, we are not going to give you that invitation, because we know how important that is for your diplomatic credentials, etc. And that is certainly causing Netanyahu a lot of problems, and it's something which he has to solve in the days to come. The most important diplomatic actions which happened this week, which certainly Israel is keeping a close eyes on, was the visit of Secretary of State Blinken to Saudi Arabia, where he met with MBS and other senior Saudi officials. Now, why is that important? Because there's a lot of talk about Israel-Saudi normalization. I have said before that I don't believe it's happening today or tomorrow. It's not happening as quickly as people might want and think. But what seems to be discussed, and this is what is of concern to Israel, is normalization may come as a quid pro quo from the Saudis and the Americans for some sort of agreement with Iran. The Americans, quite simply, two things are clear. First of all, there's going to be no return to the original JCPOA. No one believes that. We're far beyond that. The terms, the reference points of the JCPOA have been abrogated so many times. There's no going back to it. The second thing, which is just as important, is the US just simply does not have the span to deal with Iran at this moment. With the growth of China and with the war in Ukraine and Russia's constant saber rattling there, the US simply doesn't have the range really to deal with Iran. So there is a lot of talk of what's been called a less for less agreement, where America will demand less from Iran and they'll give less sanctions relief to Iran. That's the talk at the moment. And Israel is worried, or there are certain people in Israel that are worried, that there will be a quid pro quo, that some normalization steps will be given in exchange for this less for less, which is certainly not what Israel wants. Israel wants to roll back many of the gains that the Iranians made ever since Trump took America out of the JCPOA and basically made it redundant. They do not want to freeze it in time because they're on the cusp of uranium weaponization. Not to say that they have the mechanisms for weaponization, but they will be reaching a point, if they haven't already reached it, there's a debate about that, of the point where the uranium enrichment is to a point where it can be weaponized. So freezing it on, the sort of the final line is certainly not something which the Israelis would be happy about, because that would put them on constant vigil, and with Americans sort of stepping back and say, well, the agreement signed and we're going to trust it, is not something the Israelis would want to hear. In fact, probably at this point, the majority opinion, I would suggest, amongst the security and political and diplomatic establishment is that they would pass on normalization at this point if it came with the deal of a less for less agreement with Iran. But these are some of the things that are going to be discussed between MBS and the Secretary of State. But it's certainly causing a lot of worry in Israel, what's going on. As I said, they would like the normalization. We are moving towards normalization extremely slowly. But the question is, what will the price be? The Saudis have laid out what they want. They want a nuclear program, something similar to Iran. That's also of concern in Jerusalem, because that could lead to a nuclear weapons race. Egypt have suggested that they would also like to be in the game. Turkey are not far behind. So to give Saudi a nuclear program of that ilk would certainly be something of concern to Jerusalem. Also, there's talk of some sort of defense agreement in line with NATO, which is probably a non-starter, but the Saudis are certainly raising the stakes, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out after this 3-day visit by Secretary Blinken. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on these or any other issues.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee asking, will there be any diplomatic meetings with Egypt, or have there been, after the murder of 3 Israeli soldiers?
Not at the highest levels, and certainly not openly. That was an event which caused a lot of diplomatic discomfort. It remains to be seen exactly what will come out of it, whether the person acted alone or not. Certainly the Egyptians have apologized for it. There'll be a lot of talks behind the scenes to try and limit and compartmentalize it, to try and sort of put it in the past. Obviously, there are 3 families who have lost their loved ones. So in Israel, it's not going anywhere too soon. And obviously, it's along a border which is arguably Israel's quietest border, or one of Israel's quietest borders. So for this to happen, it's certainly a great concern, but there won't be any high-level official diplomatic meetings probably surrounding this particular event at this point, but there are constantly, and there have been very high-level meetings behind the scenes, or talks, I should say, rather than meetings.
Of course. Eric asked, where is Saudi Arabia on the Iran situation, and why would MBS want a U.S.-Iran less for less agreement?
Well, the Saudis despite the agreement they signed a number of weeks ago with midwife by China, and the fact that embassies are going to be returned, the fact that Syria is going to be returned, which is an Iranian proxy state, is going to be returned to the Arab League, there's still no love lost. There's still no great trust between the 2 nations. But quite simply, this is more about the way the geopolitical situation is working. Don't forget, Iran is in a very strong position It has growing relations with Russia. It's growing relations with China. China is becoming a major, some argue the major player in the region, and Saudi Arabia had to get on board on that because the Iranians were certainly getting closer and closer. So the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I would argue, is more about China than anything else. Certainly, Saudis are as worried about an Iranian nuclear weapon program as Israel is, and that's why one of their stipulations to the US is to have something of equal nature to what Iran has. Maybe they're hoping to get to a point where there's this sort of mutually assured destruction that there was during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US, but they want to be able to defend themselves. And when Saudis talk about defending themselves, it's only really the Shiite extremist axis led by Iran. That's their major threat in the region. So they are as worried about the nuclear weapons program. And I'm sure MBS will be making that extremely clear. But the Secretary of State, the US, may be saying this is all we have to offer at this point. JCPOA is dead. There really is no military option. I'm suggesting, I'm not saying that's what the Americans will be saying, and at least not openly. The Americans openly are still saying that option is on the table, but they may be saying this is the best that we can get at this point. And for that, we will give you A, B, and C, whatever that may be. The Americans have said that part of their talks are to try and bring some sort of normalization between Israel and the Saudis, but that's certainly not going to be the main subject between them. There are far greater issues between the two nations than dealing with Saudis' possible relations with Israel. So the Saudis are no less concerned about Iran as they were 1 month ago, 1 year ago, but they understand the Americans have they have less capacity, they have less attention span, and the Chinese and the Russians are moving in, and Iran is in a good place. So a lot of what's happening in the region is not really because of what's going on in the region, it's what's happening geopolitically, and the Americans receding from the region to a certain extent, and the Russians and the Chinese coming in is very much playing into that. And I think Secretary Blinken is trying to reassure the Saudis that no, we're still here, we're still paying attention, we're still allies, but that they see the way the wind is blowing.
Absolutely. Robert Larrick asks, would MBS or the U.S. support a joint military attack on Iran if it passed a threshold?
Would Saudi and say it again, would the Saudis
and the Saudis and the U.S. support a joint military attack on Iran if it passed the threshold?
I mean, that's quite a wide question. First of all, what do you mean by support? Second of all, who would actually be involved? Is it supporting from the sidelines? Is it being actively involved? The Americans are, conducting maneuvers, sometimes with Israel, sometimes on their own, to sort of show Iran that, it does have that capability, but that's still a long way from actually enacting that capability. It's extremely doubtful that the Saudis would ever be involved in the actual, in any attack on Iran. There's always been that debate, because of refueling purposes, could any sort of attack use Saudi airspace? Again, that would be tacit to be involved. It's a very hard question. They would certainly, behind the scenes, egg on any sort of attack, and if it was successful, they'd be extremely happy about it because they do feel and are threatened by the Iranian nuclear weapons program. But it's a hard question to answer because without the details, as they say, the devil is in the details. So it'd be hard to say, but certainly Saudis are no lovers of the Iranian nuclear program. They would support an ending of the program, whether diplomatically or militarily. The Americans, whether they would get involved, whether they give tacit approval, whether they would sort of give what's been described as as an amber light. They're not giving a green light, but they're not giving a red light. There are so many factors involved. It'd be very hard to sort of answer that question definitively at this point.
Absolutely. And one last one on this point. Barack Korkmaz asked, do you think Israel will move against Iran without U.S. involvement? And are they ready for a multi-front war?
Openly, Israel says yes. If it has to go it alone, it will go it alone. Does Israel have the capability? It's working on it. It claims that it does. It claims constantly that it does have the ability. It doesn't go into any details, but it says we have the ability to deal with any threat from our enemies. The statements that have come out recently from the Prime Minister, from the Defense Minister, from the Chief of Staff, from even Army Intelligence have been very bellicose in saying that there is no threat, there is no enemy that we can't touch. And so you can read into that and say that they're trying to send a message to Iran and all of Iran's proxies and our enemies around the region that we are ahead of them, that we have the ability to stop whatever it is that they're doing. Whether that's true, I have no knowledge, inside knowledge of that, but I'm sure this is something which has been at the top of the military agenda for a number of years. It's something that Netanyahu has placed at the top of his agenda. It is stopping Iran. Having the capability is the first basic, part of that. They claim they do. So we have to trust them on that, but it's clear at this point they haven't decided to act on it. I think they want to see what's happening diplomatically. They want to see if America gives it the green light or the amber light. If Iran has crossed that threshold, if it's decided to cross that threshold, there is a debate within Israel whether it's going to get all the way up to the threshold and then stop and just be a breakout nation. That could also be a problem, and that leaves a very strong dilemma amongst Israeli decision makers whether that's even a red line or not. There's a debate within the Israeli security establishment about that. So again, there's a lot of factors still in play before that question can be definitively answered.
Thank you. Michael Kerbel asked, what's happening with the judicial reform process? Virtually nothing is in the media. You did talk about that there's a compromise on the table, but what is happening right now? Is that actually on the table?
Well, again, it depends who you ask. It depends what time of day it is. There are discussions at the president's house that have been going on for quite a while. There are optimistic sounds coming out. There are those who say the agreement is almost ready. What is interesting is in 1 week, the 14th, the Judicial Selection Committee has to meet. And that's one of the sorest points for those who want to reform the system, because they believe that it's far too weighted against the democratically elected representatives, the government, the coalition, the Knesset. And there were, at least at one point, threats by Justice Minister Yair Levin not to allow the committee to convene. But there are, I believe, dozens of justices throughout the system that need to be given the green light. And without this committee, they can't be. The opposition had a bit of a disagreement this week exactly who should be their representative, because the opposition gets a representative. In the end, they went for Karen El-Haram of the Yesh Atid party at one point. Benny Gantz wanted someone, even Mirav Michaeli, with her 4 seats, wanted to have a representative. But in the end, Sena has prevailed, and they decided on one, and they put up one. On the other side, the coalition apparently have as many as 9 possible participants in that committee. It will have to be whittled down to 1, and then the committee will have to meet. But that is quite a lot of leverage taken out of the coalition side, because part of it was that they want to reform this committee. And if they're basically not going to be able to reform the committee before the committee meets, we're basically standing on the previous criteria, which again gives the elected representatives or the majority from the coalition and the government the minority pick, and gives the judicial system itself the majority pick, which is really a bone of contention. And we'll have to wait and see a week today whether that committee does meet, in what format, and if the Justice Minister allows it.
Thank you so much. And in our last minute here, you mentioned the government is not being welcomed by the West. What exactly can Netanyahu do to change this view right now?
I think once or if the judicial review is dealt with either through compromise or taken off the table, I don't see it being taken off the table. Even a compromise will be difficult for him amongst his coalition allies. But once that is sorted out, I think it will be much easier. I think if and when he gets that invitation from President Biden, other countries will follow suit. I should say, maybe I was a little bit harsh. He has been welcomed in Paris, in London. He did have those meetings early on in this particular tenure, but the big one for Netanyahu is the invitation to the White House, and that has not been forthcoming. I'm not sure exactly if this is the longest an Israeli prime minister has waited for an invitation, but if you compare it with Lapid and Bennett, it certainly doesn't compare well, or even previous Netanyahu regimes. And it's clear, and it's not just clear, it's a message that is being sent openly and behind closed doors, that at this point in time, they're unhappy with what Netanyahu is doing, not just in judicial reform. That is a major part of it, but they believe on settlements, on some of the laws which are winding their way through the Knesset, some of the statements which are being made by some of the government ministers. So there's quite a few things, but I think the main issue is the judicial reform. I think they want to use that as leverage, and certainly it's working as far as Netanyahu is concerned, because Netanyahu has frozen the process and has spoken very moderately about it, saying that we will seek compromise, that he is looking, to sort of get some sort of joint input from the opposition before this moves forward any further.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Mohammed Twahidi discussing peace between Jews and Muslims, permissible and achievable. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.